and welcome to TVNPA's February community program, The Power of Nonprofit Advocacy. Yes, we can, and why we must. We're thrilled to have all of you here today, especially excited to welcome our guest speaker, Geoff Green, the CEO of Cal Nonprofits, who made the trip from Santa Barbara for us. Yeah, so thank you, Geoff. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment and thank Sandia National Labs for sponsoring TVNPA's community programs. Yes, thank you. Their generous support allows these programs to be free and open for all. All right, Geoff, you can start walking up here. Geoff leads an alliance of over 10,000 nonprofits working to advance policy, advocacy, education, and research to build a more powerful, politically engaged nonprofit sector across California. Before this role, he served as CEO of California's largest community college foundation, led efforts in the College Promise movement, and helped secure a record-breaking $100 million gift to 24 community colleges. Prior to that, he was executive director of an activist-led social justice fund. He has worked in public affairs radio programming, campaign field organizing, and nonprofit training and facilitation. Needless to say, he's done a lot, and today he's here to share his expertise with all of us. Please help me welcome Geoff Green.
Thanks so much. Good morning. It's going to be a high-energy presentation, just so you know. Woo! I had like 3 more cups of coffee just out there. Last time I was here, actually, thank you, Kathy, and to the Tri-Valley Nonprofit Alliance. What you do is what we do, and it's really important to have those regional partners. So we're delighted that we get to work together in multiple ways. Last time I was in this theater was actually with many of you. I recognize some friends. Actually viewing Uncharitable and hearing Dan Plata last May. Kathy reminded me it was May. It's all a blur at this point. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about, a lot about, advocacy and how it works, lobbying and what it is, and why it is so darn important now. Now we planned this, Kathy's going to have to remind me, probably last fall. Started talking about getting this on the calendar. We knew this is always needed. I'm an evangelist in a big way for this kind of work. But little did we know exactly how much. So I'm going to end today with some very specific things that have happened since the 27th of January that directly talk about the nonprofit sector and the relationship with the federal government. But up until then, I'm going to give you sort of my high level. These are all the things that I think are really important. I know in this room that some of you are veteran advocates for the sector and you engage in this regularly. This is very comfortable territory for you. And for others, I'm sure this is newer. So I'm gonna try to speak to all of that, but I can think on my feet. You can stop me and ask me questions. There should be time at the end as well. So when I get rolling and fast talking, if I'm skipping over something, just say, Geoff, stop, and we'll stop. Fair? Okay, let's see if our clicker works. And what if it doesn't? What if... that is a really nice looking slide. I just want you all to look at that for a minute. We're on. It's syncing. And it's still not working. All right. You know what I can do? I can do that. I've got buttons, and that means I will stay right here as we do this. Okay. So let me tell you briefly about what we do. So we are a 40-year-old organization founded in the mid-1980s, 84 and 85. Our background, we came out of a specific set of needs and context at that time, one of which actually was insurance. So I first met Cal Nonprofits. I'm a relatively new, and I'm going to do my finger quotes on that, CEO to Cal Nonprofits. I've been in this seat for about a year, but before that I was on the board for 7 years. Before that I was on the policy committee. Before that I was a happy customer. Like that old hair club for men thing. I liked it so much, I joined the company, as you can see. But this was always the work that really fascinated me. So it came out of the insurance need. I actually ran a small nonprofit that needed health coverage for its employees, and it was 2.5 employees. I was the half. And so from that on, for 25 years, I've really seen this organization as one of the great leaders in advocating for the nonprofit sector, the good it does, and really helping all of us do our work better. So, policy and advocacy, that's what we're going to talk about today, so I'm going to leave that aside. Education, we do a lot of webinars. In the olden days, as you might remember, before 2020, we did a lot of things like this, showing up in community, working with partners. We're going to start doing a lot more of that, so this is part of that as well. There was a webinar the other day that as of Monday the 27th of January, we had 247 people signed up for it. By Thursday, there were 2,800 and something people signed up for it, and I don't have to tell you why. So there are moments where we just have to respond, and one of the great things about the current Zoom moment is it's really easy to gather people quickly in that context. So we do a lot of education. Data and research, I'll touch on that as well. This is something we do less of, but it is critical. We often push out research and data about the sector. We use it in our advocacy and lobbying work, but we also occasionally see a hole in what's available, and we will actually go do that. Right now is one of those times, and I'll talk about the current study that we're working on as well. So that's a bit about us and how we work. I will give you 3 things that we do that are a little more high profile as well. Some of you have participated, I know that. This is California Nonprofits Day. It was started 10 years ago. And it was one of the layers of our building a footprint for advocacy in Sacramento with the nonprofit sector. This was simple. The idea was, let's go to our 120 elected legislators, ask each of them to simply highlight, lift up, celebrate, name a nonprofit in their district that they want to give attention and acknowledgement to. Any nonprofits of the year in the room right now? Yes! Thank you. Congratulations. What year? 2020. Hey, you're a newbie today. Okay, congratulations. So did you attend the luncheon? Yes. So this was very simple. I'll let you tell the story to these folks later, the specifics. But basically what we do is we gather all of these nonprofits in Sacramento on the lawn of the Capitol with the legislature and just say, look how impressive, important, critical this work is, look how powerful this sector is, and that's what we do. The first year, I think it was 58 legislators out of the 120. You may know there's 80 assembly people, and there are 40 senators in California. Last year, 117 of the 120 participated. So we're going for full this year. It's going to be 120, right, Lynn? I want to introduce, so Lynn knows she introduced herself earlier, but she is our director of membership as well. So we're all around you here today. This is something that we do every year, and this will be the 10th year. After this year, I think we will have celebrated over 1,000 nonprofits after this year, so May 21st of this year. Second thing is our policy conference. We have done this for many years. We were doing it every other year pre-pandemic, and then during the COVID period, we were doing it annually online. But last year, for the first time in 7 years, or 6 years, I guess it's 2018 was the last in person, and then we did 2024 in person. So we are back now to in person. This will be done every year. This year is November 5th, and this is open to everyone, so you don't have to be nominated to do this. Just come one, come all. Registration will open in the summer. And it was a really energized, great day. You can see Speaker Rivas, the new Speaker of our Assembly there on the upper left that was speaking. Anand Jaradras was our keynote, if you know Anand. And so it was just a great day. All right, last thing I'll tell you is causes count. This is probably my favorite thing that we've ever done. I use it all the time. It is now very old. This is the problem. It was done in 2014, updated briefly in 17, re-released in 19. And we are working on a new one to come out later this year. This was the first study to try to name the economic impact of our sector to be used in a lot of this lobbying and advocacy work that we all do. Because oftentimes, and I will say this several times this morning, people think of the nonprofit sector as nice people that do good stuff and solve problems. Right? You own that, right? That's what we are. And we're a massive economic force. We're a huge employer. We are a lot of other things too. And that's the leap we're trying to make here for the legislature, right? So this is some resources to cover that, and I will give you just a few excerpts. So we also do other kinds of data research. This one on the left is the impact of student debt on the sector. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but we all know either firsthand or secondhand about what that challenge looks like. So if you walk into the sector at any age and you're carrying student debt and you're going into a sector that is your passion work, but it might be less well paid and compensated than others, how can you make that work? So we talk about what does that mean for the sector and how do we work on that, and there's some new benefits we try to walk our talk. So we introduced the new benefit whereby all employees of Cal Nonprofits now, if they carry student debt, we make a direct payment to pay down their loans as part of their employee benefits. That was a new benefit that was created by the federal government in 2021. And then we went out and evangelized about it and said, you could do this too for relatively low cost. So things like that, public service loan forgiveness, things like that. On the right are some excerpts from the last causes count, and these are some of the data points that I always point to. You can see there 15% of California's gross domestic product or gross state product is actually generated by the nonprofit sector. That's not a data point that most people think about or use when we're talking about policy. So we're trying to get those big numbers out there. Okay, so let's talk about data for a minute. I'm going to give you some numbers. Some of you have seen me do this before. It's just kind of my favorite thing. Anyone know what this one is? This is the number of nonprofit public charities, 501c3s in California. 109,000 of us. This is according to the Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office. So that's what that is. So that's a number we should all know. You can say over 100,000, you can round it. There's all kinds of little caveats to that, like, yeah, but are they really all active? Well, but how many of them are staffed? I can give you two other data points. One, yes, some of these are on paper only and they may be quiet for the moment. Of all active nonprofits, 2/3 are not staffed. 2/3 of us are all volunteer associations. And that's powerful too, because if you think about the value of the work that we do voluntarily, as everybody engaged with a nonprofit, we, the collective we, that's billions of dollars worth of labor. So, all right, there's one. Let's go to number 2. This is a big number. 11 trillion, actually considerably more than, although we'll see how that goes. These are the annual dollars in public expenditure in the United States every year. So if you take the federal budget, all state budgets, county budgets, city budgets, put it all together, you're in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 13, 14-digit number. The reason that's important, and this is not a number that you should just toss around in casual conversation at cocktail parties, but you could. I'd love to see what kind of reaction you get. This is the other one that some of you may recognize. If you are a fundraiser in the room and you read Giving USA's annual report out of the Lilly School of Philanthropy about what is the total private giving in the United States every year, $557.16 billion was the last one we have. We're about to get the 2024 report. That was 2023's number. And these two numbers together are what I want to point out. If you look at the ratio there, so 11 trillion, 557 and some change billion, it's about a 20-to-1, and that's been fairly consistent. So public expenditure to private charitable expenditure, 20-to-1 over the years. And here's what I want to say about that. If that public expenditure is poorly spent, if it has huge externalized costs, damage to communities, environment, if whatever it is, $1 charitable spending ain't gonna fix it, right? So 20-to-1, this is part of the argument of why we have to be engaged in policy, advocacy, and budget setting, because that number has to be guided in part by the nonprofit sector. Because otherwise, it's a losing game. We're tinkering at the margins, we're not gonna fix it. But if our charitable work is both doing the work on the ground and influencing how the public expenditure, that's a bigger power. That makes sense? So that's how I tend to think about this stuff when I'm thinking about it, which is usually. And then this last one is a really valuable one. That's the percent of people in California, the last set of surveys that we did, that had something positive to say about the nonprofit sector. They like us. They really, really like us. People trust the nonprofit sector. And they don't think of it as the nonprofit sector. This is our challenge. So it's that 20-to-1 challenge, and it's the challenge to say, oh yeah, that after-school program you love, that's a nonprofit. That climate justice work that you're a part of, that's a nonprofit. That service to veterans, that's a nonprofit. That shelter, that's a nonprofit. That anti-violence program, that's a nonprofit. That reentry program, that's a nonprofit. You get the idea. And people know that nonprofit and they love it, but they don't think of, oh, this is the nonprofit sector that I'm now engaging with. That would be weird. They think about the actual organization. So, that's just the background. So with that as sort of framework, the rest of this hopefully will make sense. We need to be telling our stories because people actually want to hear them. I don't know about you, Melanie and I just met for the first time in person, and you know what started going through my head? And I apologize for this. Arms of the Angels, Sarah McLachlan. I cannot think of that song and not think of puppies. Damn it, Sarah, look what you've done. Now, if you don't know, if you know, you know. If you don't know, never mind. No, Gen Xer right here, never mind. But there are storytelling and marketing moments where like that sticks. And there are a lot of those out there. So we have to keep telling those stories and getting people to connect and say, this is what you do and this is why. And I'm just throwing you a curveball because I'm giving you a data point about storytelling. That's not the point. But there's lots of reasons out there why, but just we got to learn to tell our stories and constantly tell them. We have to invest in the marketing and the communications. We have to get those press releases out there. We have to get in front of microphones and cameras. We have to write letters. We have to tell the story of why. Because the data is critical, but you also have to connect at a heart level. So you have to have the brain and the heart engaged. And that's, humans are some mix of that, all of us. Some people are very data-driven. They want to hear, like, show me what your outcomes are. Cool, I will tell you all about our outcomes, our outputs, and all of our data. And other people just say, move me. Like, get me engaged. I want to know why this is important. And we need to have both tools ready. So here are some of the data points about people trusting us. I will not go into all of these, but these are all the different ways you ask the question. There's a lot to say about why we are loved and trusted. And I'm going to keep hitting on this because when we start talking to legislators, lawmakers, rule makers, agency heads, we have to remember this. People believe us, they trust us, they want to know. More than any other sector, they trust the nonprofit sector. So what we say carries weight, we just need to say it more. Here's some more of those data points. These were all based on a survey that we did back in 18 and 19. And there's lots of versions of this, but you can see the numbers are all high. They're different levels of high, but they're up there. And so if you put it all together, that's that 90% you had earlier. And all this is to say, and you can chant this with me, is that, ready? No. Say it. Nonprofits. Can.
And. Should. Advocate. And. Lobby.
Yay! That's my Tech 1.0 PowerPoint chant. It's not animated, it's just click, 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 click. All right, so this is what we need to remember, is that we could do this. This is, we're not only are we not barred from doing it, we are frankly encouraged to do it. And there's a lot of miseducation out in the world. Many of us were miseducated, heard the message, you can't be political, and I'm gonna finger quote it again. That is false, absolutely false, never was true. You can't be partisan. That's the red line, meaning I can't get up here and stump for a candidate, or bash a party, or do anything in that part of the political world. But when it comes to policy, and budgets, and values, and priorities, that's our zone. And so that's the part that we often miss. And I think that's what we're here today to talk about, is how can you do this and do it well? Not everyone's gonna go full lobby, right? Advocating though, a lot of us do it already, we don't even know. So these are different things, and lobbying and advocating are different. There is a technical definition, and we're going to tell you all about that here in a second. But I want to go back a little ways. I don't know if this is what it really looked like, this is the early 19th century. But how many of you know this sort of this apocryphal story about de Tocqueville coming to the United States in the 1820s, 30s, kind of this new country, trying to figure out what this new emerging culture was or wasn't? The thing that stood out is, so he was French, he was checking it out, was that all these people are like creating these organizations. Like, that didn't happen back in his home country. It was like, what are these folks doing? Every time there's a new idea, they start clubs, they like to have little associations, and this was sort of the roots of this notion of civic engagement, civic life, in the way that Americans tend to do it. And it has changed over the years, and it has grown and has expanded. But it is an interesting observation from someone coming from outside way back when, saying, people just kind of create their own, and some of this these were advocates, right? These were social justice organizations, these were mutual aid societies, these were religious, this was all a way that people tended to organize. So that is one history that we need to, I think, own and build on. Here's the other one. For most of our history, there wasn't really a specific rule about those community organizations, civil societies, mutual aid, how they interacted with politics. They just kind of did their thing. Some of them were very politically engaged, others weren't. But in the last century, we started to get more formalized tax rules. And in the middle of the last century, this happened. And this is something that used to be very obscure, but I bring it up now because it is being talked about, and in some ways that are very concerning. The Johnson Amendment, and that was the same Johnson, that's why I put his face on the poster on the right, so that he later was President Lyndon Johnson after the assassination of President Kennedy. But before that, he was a senator from Texas. And before that, he was a local elected official. And for reasons that were not high-minded, let me be clear, I don't want to credit Johnson for doing this wonderful high-minded thing and putting up this partisan wall for us. He was doing it to keep an opponent out of the ring, essentially. But it worked, and it stuck, and it became a bipartisan consensus principle for the last 75 years. And that, to this day, is true. So the Johnson Amendment, which was actually passed in 1954 as part of one of the tax acts of the last century, says that nonprofit 501c3 public charities may not engage, and you can see the quote right there, or intervene, including publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of, and then in the 80s they added, or in opposition to, any candidate for public office. So the 86th Amendment was part of Reagan's tax bill. That came in and said, oh, and it's not just for, it's also opposed. But that has been the principle, that is the dividing line. And that's why I can confidently say, stay here and say we need to be out there lobbying and advocating, because there's a line. As long as we're not doing it in a partisan fashion, we're absolutely entitled, empowered, and I would argue, expected to be engaged in policy. That little cartoon on the left is one of the many ways that it has been graphically illustrated of, why is this so important? If you go back to those high numbers of approval of the nonprofit sector, a lot of that is because of the fact that we're not partisan. And the less partisan we are, the more trusted we are, and especially now. In the last 50 years, I was listening to, here's another book. Have anyone read Bill Bishop's The Big Sort? Okay, if you're into sociology or political science history, it's a great book. It talks about how since World War II, the US has self-segregated into like-minded thinking communities, geographically as well as. This is before smartphones and internet and everything. We were kind of self-selecting into these thinking alike communities, which makes this a very fraught moment for a lot of reasons. But right up there, what you see there is the charitable sector is kind of on its own island. It's like we're not playing with any side of a partisan debate. We're talking policy, we're talking values, we're talking principles, we're talking priorities of our communities. So that is why it's so important. The reason I bring it up now, in addition, is that for the first time in my lifetime that I can remember, in the 2016 presidential race, candidates started talking about it. And one candidate in particular started saying, I want to get rid of it. And that was alarming, and should be alarming to all of us, that if this is something that is targeted, if this goes away, I think we're in trouble as a sector. And this is how it might go away. So this was an obscure court case filed last year. You can see there the March 18th, 2024. It's in federal tax court, which it's very privately adjudicated. But it was a specific targeted case to try to undo the Johnson Amendment. Now there's been talk about it in Congress. It never really happened. President Trump is certainly, he's the candidate that most talked about it, and he's said it again in this term that he wants to get rid of the Johnson Amendment. No action has actually happened to make that happen, but something like this actually could change it. So this is the kind of thing that I think we should all be watching for, is keep that partisan line. And that's why it's so important on our own role, to make sure that we're not stepping over and doing partisan advocacy on behalf of our nonprofit sector. But I have no problem raising up, celebrating, or harshly criticizing any policy, but I'm not going to say, don't vote for so-and-so, or this party is better than that party. That's the part you can't do. Everything else, though, policy, we should be doing more. Okay, so let's talk about what this stuff actually is. Advocacy is what a lot of us already do without even thinking about it. We talk about our mission. We say this is important. We try to convince other people that we gotta do more. We have to fund this. We have to put this in our schools. We have to talk about it. We have to have more access to this offering, this service, this support. Anything like that. That's all advocacy. You talk about, this is fundraising is advocacy. Great fundraising is great advocacy in many ways. You love this, I love this, let's fund this. That's all advocacy. That's not all that scary to most people. Most people can say, yeah, I advocate because I'm passionate about this work, that's why I'm doing it. It's not to get wealthy. Lobbying is different. Lobbying is actually a very, very, very specific thing. The IRS defines it very specifically. And what I put up there are the 5 pieces. Some will say there's 4. I've divided it into 5. But you have to have all 5 for something to count as lobbying. So here's what you have to be doing. You have to be communicating, but not just as you, clearly on behalf of your organization. So I could say, as the CEO of California Association of Nonprofits, and then I have to be expressing a view, so I can't just say, why would you? That's not lobbying. About a specific piece of legislation. This is the piece that a lot of folks forget. So I can get up there and say, we need to fund early childhood education. I'm not lobbying, I'm advocating, right? I want to see universal health care. I want to see more shelter services. I want to see more robust food distribution programs. I want animal services, shelters, whatever it may be in my backyard. That's all advocating. But if I say you need to vote yes on AB 1521, but if I'm saying it to all of you all, anyone here elected to the state legislature? Okay, then I'm not lobbying. I'm just saying, this is what we think we should be doing. But if I'm sitting across from Senator Limon, who I'll talk about in a bit here, and I say, we really need to get SBs, as in Senate Bill, 215 passed. Now I'm lobbying. I'm speaking on behalf of my organization to the person that has the power to do something, and I'm expressing a specific opinion. So that's the key. So I have to be saying, I need X vote on this piece of legislation, and I'm speaking on behalf of this organization, which is a 501c3 public benefit charity. Now I'm lobbying. And that's great. How many of you have done any kind of lobbying? I'm just curious, formal lobbying. Right on, people. Okay. That asterisk at the bottom, that is how the federal government, state government, all governments measure it, but particularly the IRS. So this is the other piece that is shocking to many. It's that it's measured in how many dollars did you spend to do that. Now, if I just had a 15-minute conversation, it didn't cost much, unless I'm getting paid a lot more than anyone thinks. No, I'm only 15 minutes of my time on behalf of my organization in this conversation. Now, if I want to be conservative, I'll add the trip, the cost of getting there for that conversation, but if it's a call, again, it's relatively inexpensive. You're just expressing this opinion. So this is what we're going to get into the weeds on right now. And I also want to say there are two kinds of lobbying, according to the IRS. And some of you know this because I saw some heads nod. There is direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. And this is the part where it starts to get really clear. You need to get clear on what the rules are and how you measure it. And I'll tell you why you have to measure it in a moment. But direct lobbying is what I just described. It's going straight to the rulemaker, legislator, elected official, saying, I'd like you to vote this way on this issue. And I'm speaking on behalf of this organization. Grassroots lobbying is very familiar to us, especially if you've done community organizing work. But this is the definition. You're actually communicating, and you're expressing that same view, but you're doing it with the public. It could be your membership, it could be the whole world, and you're saying, call Senator so-and-so and make sure they vote this way. Interestingly, the IRS puts a much stricter limit on the second one than the first one. And if you think about why, they're actually onto something. That's relatively powerful. If you can move 100 people to make a call, you can say it yourself, depending on what your relationship is, but if you suddenly flood the switchboard in the Capitol Hill, that's powerful. So there is a stricter limit on grassroots lobbying, and we'll talk about those limits here in just a second. But those are the two kinds. And if you get into this, you measure it, and you keep track of it, and then you report it. And it's real simple and clean. Any questions on that? So if you put it like in your newsletter, let's say, if you have an e-newsletter, some people still have mailed newsletters, not a lot, but some do. But if you put in an e-newsletter and say, please call so-and-so, last fall, HR 9495, that ring a bell? A lot of folks caught that. If those of us that saw that come to the floor, when Speaker Johnson brought it to the floor, we saw the vote count, we saw that a lot of folks that we did not expect to be supporters were supporting it, and we got on the phone and on email, that was direct lobbying. But when I sent that out to the Cal Nonprofits list, which has about 53,000 people on it, that's grassroots lobbying. And I said, call these folks and tell them they voted incorrectly, please correct your behavior. No, I didn't say it that way. Sometimes I say it that way, I don't usually say it that way. That doesn't go very far. But, okay, that clear? Good.
Quick question.
Yeah, Kathy.
So, for instance, we passed that email on to our members.
You are now lobbying. And what you would be measuring is how long did it take you to put out that email? 5 minutes. And you get paid, what, $5 million a year? Right? Okay. So 5 minutes out of, yeah, exactly.
So one of our members passed it on to their people too. They would be lobbying, but it's, so let's share your lobbying.
Yeah. It is technically lobbying if you are asking people, even if you're sharing someone else's ask, it becomes your ask. And it's the grassroots guy, because it's saying, would you please contact these folks to do this thing? If you're just educating, and we do a lot of this too, a lot of our emails say, hey, heads up, this is happening. It doesn't tell you what to do about it necessarily, it just says, we're keeping an eye on it, and maybe we don't think there is something to do yet. We're not lobbying yet, we're just saying, heads up. When we say, call Adam Schiff and tell him he needs to vote this way as one of California's new senators, then we're lobbying. So. And I bring him up because he was one of those people that voted it correctly and then did the right thing. So, okay. So the IRS has 2 tests on lobbying. This is the old one, and I'm going to discourage you from messing with it, but you can. So for most of our history, this is what the IRS said. That is a quote from their website, you can look it up, and they use the term substantial part. I dare any of you to actually define it, even though they're trying here. And they're basically saying, as long as your influence on legislation, i.e. lobbying, and that's their bolding, constitutes a substantial part of its overall activities determined on the basis of all pertinent facts and circumstances, in each case, they can. So what they're saying is, as long as you're primarily not there to do lobbying, and you're a 501c3 public charity nonprofit, that's probably fine. There is no line. They're not telling you what's substantial, what's insubstantial. They're not telling you how close to the line. You just kind of do it, and you're warned that they're going to be looking. And if they start seeing things that look kind of funky, they're going to call you and say, what was that about? So that was the old way. It was a reactive model. So you didn't have to do anything. You just did your work, and you internally policed yourself, made sure you weren't doing substantial part lobbying, and on you went. Now, for most organizations, that actually was fine, because the amount of lobbying they did was that big. So if you're passing on 5 emails throughout the course of a year, everything else is course charitable service work, not an issue. But if someone wanted to push back on you, or there was an elected official that said, I think you should go audit the Tri-County Nonprofit Association. Did you see what they just did? I don't like that. Then you would have to go through that. What they did a few years back, actually a couple decades back, is this. I love the 501h election. I need different things to love. But I have done this with every organization that I've ever served with. And this is the entire form 5768. I dropped that in a cocktail conversation. Hey, do you fill out form 5768? Yeah, me too. Weirdo. Anyway, that is the form, and that is the entire form, by the way. You're looking at it. This may be the simplest IRS form you've ever seen. And all you do it one time. And so the organization says, we are going to engage proactively in lobbying work. It's part of our mission. We're going to embrace that. We're going to declare it. And we're going to tell the IRS, we lobby. You file that form. You don't have to file it again, but you've now put the IRS on notice. And then annually, on your Form 990, you have a separate schedule that you add to it, and just every year you measure in dollars how much did you spend on lobbying. And just report it. I have never worked for an organization, even highly politically engaged organizations that work on a broad range of policy, come close to the limits that the IRS dictates, and it's never been a problem. That doesn't mean it can't be, and again, it doesn't mean that somebody might see what you're doing and not like it and try to make life hard for you. But you are nowhere near those limits 99% of the time. And that is what I would say is the way to do it. So if you're new to this or you haven't done this yet, this is a great way to just get really clear, own it, declare it every year, measure it, file for it. And boards of directors in particular that might be nervous about this, staff often are the ones that are pushing on this, saying, we really need to do this kind of engagement. And we're just like, I don't know, that sounds over the line to me. This is the kind of stuff you can say, well, let me just show you this. It's really clear, and the website is very clear. This is also direct from the website, so let's talk about the limits. So the majority of organizations, nonprofits, are small. As I said, 2/3 have no staff. And then that curve of capacity and size is sort of long and low, and then it spikes, right? So kind of a logarithmic curve. I'm sorry, from where you're sitting, it would be this way. This is how it is measured. 20% is sort of that lowest ceiling, and that's for organizations of $500,000 annual expenditure, this is what we're measuring here, or less. So let's say you're a $500,000 a year operation. You can spend up to 20% on lobbying. There are very few that would get that far, because again, it's the dollars measuring it. So even if you're doing a lot of engagement, you're making a lot of calls and you're sending emails, it's not expensive. And so you can do an amazing amount, well within the limits, having declared and done your 501h election this way. As it grows, the cap kind of curves like this. So you can see there each of those, and 17 million, I don't know why, but that's their top level, and they cap it at $1 million of lobbying expense. So if you're a $17 million operation or larger, you can spend up to $1 million a year on lobbying. There is a sub-restriction on this, going back to that grassroots one. So it gets more complicated. I would say if you get into this is where you should probably talk to someone. Do your homework, talk to a tax professional or an attorney to figure out what your number is. But again, this is publicly posted right there on the IRS website. Of that 20%, 5% or 1/4 of it, that's the grassroots limit. So you could spend $100,000 total on lobbying, but only up to $50,000 on your actual grassroots lobbying, if that makes sense. I'm sorry, 25. So you have a lower limit on the grassroots called action, and then the higher limit on the overall lobbying. But you can see here, there's a lot of room. There is a lot of room to lobby because it is not that expensive, but what you're measuring is the cost of doing it. So even if you include, the car trip or the plane trip to Sacramento or the train trip to Sacramento, even if you include the overnight in the hotel, the day, the meals, the time you spent with the legislator and your trip home, and it's in the context of this budget, it's still not that much. And arguably, not all of that is all your lobbying costs, because if you went there and did other things, it doesn't all apply to the 15-minute, 30-minute, 60-minute conversation you got, or the committee hearing that you went to. So there's a lot of ways to look at it, but in the end, the point is there's a lot of room here. I'm going to stop there. Any questions on that? Yes?
What if you have volunteers in the lobbying? Unpaid?
Yeah, volunteers are not getting paid to do it. Now, you may have empowered them to lobby on your behalf, but you're not paying them, so there's no salary cost or hourly cost that goes with that.
You don't have to account for that?
No, but you would say if you prepared them, if you, let's say the executive director or the policy director sat with the volunteers, did a training, and then volunteer went and did it. My advice, and I'm not an attorney, but would be include all of that just to be on the conservative side, but you would still not have any actual cost of a volunteer doing it. The volunteer would have to be empowered to represent you. Most organizations, that's where they'll go like call to action style, just like everybody go do it. They rarely empower a single volunteer to do it unless they're not a paid staff organization at all, in which case the director or leader or chair is a volunteer. And then that's the person that does it. But yeah, that's one great example of why it's really not that expensive to do this. So, yeah.
I'm sorry, you said it and I missed it. What percentage is the cap for the grassroots?
It's 5%. So of the 500,000, you can go up to 25,000 grassroots and the remaining 75,000 lobbying. Or you can do all of it in direct lobbying. But there's a sub-limit for the grassroots lobbying.
5% of what your...
Of the total expenditure. Or you can think of it this way, 1/4 of that 20%, so 5 of that 20, that's the grassroots period. Yeah, it gets a little fun. But if you put it in numbers, let's say you're using a $500,000 budget, you can spend $25,000 maximum grassroots and another $75 direct lobbying, and you're still, then you're at your 100 total. So, yes sir?
Yeah, can I ask you what you're hearing about on the standard deductions versus itemized deductions, IRS income? Are you hearing anything, or are you advocating for itemized charitable deductions on the standard IRS income forms?
Yes, so that tax debate, as we all probably know, is coming soon. It's two things. It was the 2017 Tax Cuts and Job Act that President Trump has certainly said he wants to get extended, and Congress is going to debate that shortly. That deduction piece has been wrapped into that debate, but it is actually a longer freestanding debate, as you point out. The best resource for that, I would say, is the National Council of Nonprofits, which I'll plug here in a minute. There's actually a pretty sizable policy, sort of tax policy agenda that we've signed on to, and a lot of our state associations have when it comes to the federal deduction. And so there's a considerable amount of advocacy in the nonprofit sector about enshrining better tax deductions for all people, all donors, and that was one of the things that the 2017 Act actually undermines, and not even clearly intentionally, but what it meant was that most people no longer got a deduction for there were 20 million fewer itemizers as a result of that, according to the American Enterprise Institute. And so there was a question about, well, that's not the right incentive structure if we want to encourage giving to charity. So yeah, that is a big part of it. Other questions? Yes.
So if you say prepare a video or a packet and bring that with you to talk with your legislator, and if it's all educational, you don't need to worry about it, but what if it says on there, this is why we urge you to vote yes on blah, blah, blah?
I would count it. I would count, yeah. If it's just an educational tool that you produced for other purposes and you're bringing it along, you don't have to count the cost of creating it for the lobbying, because you did it for the, you did that for broader education. If, however, enshrined in that printed piece or a video piece or anything, it says something that's specific to the legislature that qualifies on those communication points, then my advice would be count it as lobbying expense. And again, given the limits, wouldn't be a problem, but it's worth doing. Yeah. I think the advice that every nonprofit attorney that I know on this stuff, that's, just if there's a question, err on the side of inclusion. It's cleaner, no one would ever challenge that, because what you don't want to do is be left where you're not counting things that look like, well, that might have really been part of your lobbying effort. And that's where you run into trouble. And given how generous those limits are, and that they're all measured in dollars, that's the advice that I typically hear. Yeah.
What does trouble look like?
What is what?
What does trouble
What does trouble look like? Well, the IRS can come in and challenge your C3 status. So bottom line is, to be a 501c3 public benefit charity, you have to be, think back to and if you didn't do it yourself, but you inherited, think back to the argument you made to the federal government and the state government to say we should be a tax-exempt 501c3 public charity. What you were arguing was that the benefit of your existence is of greater value than any corporate tax you might have had to pay were you a for-profit. And that's what they're looking at. If you start to tip more into lobbying, then you're no longer a 501c3. You're still a nonprofit of another type, but that's what they would probably, in the end, they would challenge. There are fees and fines that they can levy as well. It's relatively rare, but it does happen. So that's what trouble looks like. The other kind that I hinted at was, there have been audits of organizations that no one can prove, but it's pretty clear that was somebody with the power to say, I think we're going to take a closer look at you. So even though it's clean, it's trouble. So that's really it. It's the auditing power of the IRS, and it's the power to revoke status. So, yeah. Okay. So bottom line on this, here's what I would leave with before we get to some of the specifics, is know the rules, right? Use your expertise. Again, we collectively, nonprofits, community work, we need to own how much we know. And the way I think of it, can you imagine what our public policy landscape would look like, whether it's housing or racial justice or poverty or homelessness or anything, if the people on the ground experiencing whatever the issue is were making the policy? I mean, that's how this is supposed to work. It's not supposed to be left to third, fourth hand experience. And I think what we bring as nonprofits is that first-hand experience. If you want to know what the solution is, ask the person dealing with it. That's my philosophy. I know a lot of us share that. So use that expertise. Claim it, own it, use it, and share it with the folks that make the decisions. Telling our stories, obviously, mobilizing our base to get out there and say something. Building on the relationships. Politics is relational. We know this, so that's why it's important. This is a part 2, a part 3 down the line sometime we can do this, but when we talk about real strategy, how do you move a bill? How do you build a relationship with the legislator? How do you get that going? Make sure that they don't only hear from you when you're making an ask. And it's just like donors, if you think of it that way. You know, if the only time I hear from you is you're asking me to do something, I put you mentally in a certain box. Doesn't mean I don't like you or I won't talk to you, I will. But I know that if I see your name come up, okay, what do you need today? Right? That's human. So try to figure out ways to keep those relationships alive, because there's lots of things that we can all do together, so that when the time comes that you need something, that's a natural ask. It's not just you're only asking, you're only showing up when you need something. And then playing the long game. Policy is the long game. And it is very frustrating, especially when we come in late to the game, to further torture that metaphor, or we don't know the rules of the game. Or we have a timeout. No, that's not part of the rules. But you know, it moves in increments, and it moves in iterations, and it moves over time, and it's 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and then, you know, so think of it in those terms. Sometimes it's real simple. It's like we need this, but sometimes it's really building something over the long haul. So here's some resources. I just realized I forgot to put my own logo up there. At the upper right white space, think of Cal Nonprofits. It's down on the bottom right there. These are our favorite resources. Did you ever think I'd say the IRS was my favorite? They are actually really clear in some cases, and this is one of those cases where it's like, this is the rules. So, independent sector is one of our 2 national partners, so we're doing work at a federal level, we're working with them. They are a membership-based organization that includes philanthropy and the working charitable sector. Boulder Advocacy is a project of the Alliance for Justice, or AFJ. They are my long-standing favorite resource. I would strongly encourage you. They have incredible resources that are free to anyone that goes to their website, afj.org. And then Boulder Advocacy, they started doing so much work around this, they just named it a project called Boulder Advocacy. Before that, it was just AFJ. National Council of Nonprofits is our other national peer group. They're really the association of associations. So all the states that have nonprofit advocates, there's I think 32 of us now, plus a few other folks. That's what makes up NCN. I'll tell you more about them in a moment. And then of course the IRS itself. So there's some great resources out there. And if you're taking photos, and we'll get these slides out to everybody, but these are the specific sites where you have these resources from all these organizations. I'm going to end on this, and then we can talk about what's happening right now. So California Association of Nonprofits, we have some policy priorities about what we care about. So just our big picture agenda, if you will. This is our agenda. We advocate for public investment in our communities. And oftentimes that's with and through the nonprofit sector, but not exclusively. We're talking about making sure that federal, state, local resources are supporting, uplifting the community work that we all value. We are improving and strengthening our nonprofit sector's relationship with government. This has been our focus for this last legislative session, 2023-24 in Sacramento. I'll tell you a little bit more about that here. Supporting the nonprofit workforce. This is an emerging series of challenges. It's long-standing. We all know about undercompensation challenges, but it's all questions around burnout during COVID. Who was a frontline worker that had to go out there every day and that. And so there's a lot of things that came clearer to folks that they hadn't seen before, even if we all knew it. And there's also some longer-term sustainability questions about how can we maintain a healthy workforce, and we are a big workforce. We want to promote civic engagement, and that means voting, that means lobbying and advocacy, but it also just means volunteering and showing up. We want to ensure the independence and accountability, public accountability of nonprofits. We don't like bad actors any more than the IRS or the Department of Justice does. And this is something that's sometimes hard to explain to them when I'm talking to the Attorney General's office. They look at us as though they are policing us, and I'm like, hey, we're with you. We don't want scandal in the sector. Every time that hits the headlines, guess who gets hurt? It's not you, it's us. And so we try to say this is what we think is appropriate accountability, and we want to make sure that's something we can all do. So if you've had challenges with the Charitable Trust Registry, that has now been renamed the Registry of Charities and Fundraisers at the Department of Justice, we have too. So we want to make sure there's a user-friendliness. Like, yes, we don't mind oversight, filing, and accountability, but let's not make it so onerous that we force ourselves to mess up, and then we get slapped on the wrist for it. Protect and defend the broader values of the sector. just sort of obviously the things that we stand for. Here's what we actually are going to do this year, and I'm going to be a little bit vague because the deadline for bills is the 21st of this month, so we're a little over a week away. But the Nonprofit Equity Initiative, which we ran, which was a package of 7 bills last year, it was 23 and 24 actually. This was the good news. We had one win. If you look on the right, there's a win, AB 590, Assemblymember Hart, carried that all the way through both houses unanimously, and we got the governor's signature on it. That was the advance pay bill. So if y'all deal with slow reimbursement, late reimbursement, insufficient reimbursement, this is meant to help correct that. Like, let's pay upfront on these grants and contracts, at least in part, and then get this rolling. So we have now a bill for implementation. 590 was just a bill about enabling and sort of normalizing that, even though it's been normal for a long time, and there are plenty of examples of advanced pay going back to the 1970s. If you look across all state agencies, it was still the exception and not the rule, and it should be the rule. So advanced pay. Now we're going to have an implementation bill, hopefully carried by Assemblymember Hart, which will actually require that as of January 26, any new grant contract has to have an opportunity to negotiate advanced pay. So, incremental, long game. The reason we didn't do that the first time is we knew we wouldn't get a signature if we did. So we said, okay, let's do the permissive, and then we'll build on it. If agencies move, great, no problem. If they don't, and they didn't, then we build on it. If the governor were willing to simply say thou shalt to the agency heads, which the executive can do, that would also be a way, but our governor is not doing that either, so we're going the legislative route. Full cost, real cost, indirect cost, you all know the overhead myth and all of these debates that we have. This is to try to normalize that in California and at least bring us up to the federal level. Some of you may have caught that the Biden-Harris administration in the spring of 24, actually that OMB, Office of Management and Budget, that reports to the White House, issued new guidance that said not only should advance pay be the norm, but 15% should be the de minimis rate for any new grant or contract. California is lower than that. We actually don't have that. So we were just trying to get us caught up last year. Now we're back to that. And we're trying to combine that with another bill that also that bill got through but got vetoed. The other bill that got through and vetoed twice was the Prompt Payment Act loophole. And believe it or not, 12 years ago when we passed the Prompt Payment Act in California, we exempted nonprofits, meaning you didn't have to pay nonprofits promptly. You had to pay every other contractor promptly. But nonprofits got left out of that. There were no reporting. If they didn't get prompt payment, there were no penalties for agencies that didn't pay us promptly. But if you were a for-profit contractor, there were. So that's a little counterintuitive. So that's a loophole we're trying to close. And then finally, so these three will probably show up as 2 different bills, and there are a couple others that you'll see. And again, you'll know after February 21st, and we'll put it out there. We'll say, here's the bills, here's what we're doing, and if you're on the list, you'll see that. Streamlining charity registrations, we're actually trying a legislative fix for this as well. So we're trying to see what we can do there. Responding to the emerging insurance crises, there's at least a couple bills that are being introduced by associations and alliances that we are joining with. We're not leading that fight, but we're there with them. We think, again, in service of them being the experts on the ground, we're going to be their wing people, and we do a lot of that. Establishing a voice for nonprofits and state government. This is a new strategy. There is no advocate in the state government for the nonprofit sector. There are advocates for small business, there are advocates for all kinds of things, but there's actually no single spot to go if you have a challenge, if you have a problem, if you're trying to get something done. So we actually have a proposal out, and we may be working with philanthropy to share the cost of that with public resources. So it's an interesting negotiation, but that's what we're in the midst of. And then federal advocacy, that's a whole nother pile right now. And I do have some more slides here that I can share you about what just happened, but we are very much attuned to watching that. We've never had a threat to the entire sector of the sort that we're facing now from the current administration. So what will happen in the courts, what will happen by policy is to be determined, but we're taking that very seriously. Okay. These are the folks you should know. We helped establish this, so I talked about those layers, and we did the Celebrate Nonprofits, Nonprofits Day. Then we did the Causes Count report, and we started using that in educating legislators. This is another piece of that puzzle. We didn't have, just like we don't have an advocate or a staff level in state government, we didn't have a committee that dealt with advocacy either, or for the nonprofit sector. So in 2017, Speaker Anthony Rendon from Silver Lake, said, you know what, I'm with you, I support that, but we have no resources, you gotta organize it. And we said, okay, I know just the person. So we actually reached out to, at the time, newly elected Assemblywoman Monique Limon, who came from the nonprofit sector as well as education, said, speakers supporting this, would you like to be the founding chair? She said, I would love to do that, I'm gonna do it. So she did. So we had a select committee starting that year in the Assembly. She was then elected to the Senate 4 years later and did the same thing there. So now she chairs the Senate Select Committee on the nonprofit sector, and Assemblymember Greg Hart stepped in after Luz Rivas, so you had Monique Limon and Luz Rivas, now Assemblymember Hart chairing the Select Committee on the Assembly side. And each of these committees are populated with a dozen or so members. They hold hearings. We're their partners, but they're fully owned and operated by the legislature. And we simply offer the support to have hearings to lift up big issues. There's no real power in these committees other than lifting up big issues. So that's how we try to make those meaningful. So when we do hold hearings, I think we've held 5 so far. But bills that have passed were first raised up in those spaces, and then we got some momentum. So there's a real value to that. This is a fun little tool, and this is my last slide before we talk about what's happening right now. I'll make a pause, noting the time. We have just put this up on our website. It's call it a beta test version. We had this little brainstorm. We're talking to some other associations, and we said, well, what if we mapped the entire legislature and how they connect to the nonprofit sector? Let's do it. So we did. So we have put this up on our website. I think it comes up as V4, version 4. We scraped all the bios, all the publicly available information of all 120 members of the legislature, and looked for all the places where they called out a board they served on, a nonprofit they supported, an organization that they were passionate about, and we made little condensed bios about their connection to the nonprofit sector, all 120 members. And then we asked them, and we went directly to the offices and said, so, this is what we were able to get publicly, what are we missing? And a little less than half of them responded to us, and then we published it and they all responded. So, oh, you mean it's out there in the world? I better curate that. So I just gave a presentation yesterday morning down in Van Nuys, and these are their two representatives, so that's why those particular faces up there. But if you want anybody's record and their association with the nonprofit sector, it's there. And I'll make sure you all have this one. So this is a great tool to use to figure out, okay, who are my likely champions? Who's been engaged in this work that I may not know, and how can we connect? Okay, I'm gonna stop right there. I'm gonna look to Kathy. I have a short section of slides that kind of runs us through what just happened at a federal level. Do we have the, yeah, we happy with that? All right. Everyone take a deep breath. So, what just happened? I don't even know where to start. No, I do know where to start. Okay, so I'll tell you this quick story. Back in November, after HR 9495 was brought suddenly to the floor and then brought through Rules Committee and back to the floor and passed in the House, and then it wasn't going to have a chance in the Senate. We knew that, so that was good, but we also knew that there was enough support to get it through the House.
Can you clarify where
Yes. HR 9495 was a piece of legislation that was authored last summer, and it was framed as an anti-terrorism bill. And it had, I think, 7 sections in all, and most of it was reiterating current federal policy around terrorism and how organizations that were supportive of or engaged in what the federal government defined as terrorism, and I'm going to finger quote that too, because that was the worry, is that definition was pretty elastic. And they had a section 4 of that bill, specifically, this was the part that we were watching, empowered the Secretary of the Treasury to unilaterally declare a nonprofit a terrorist organization and pull the status and freeze all assets. Then there was no recourse. It wasn't like he said, we think you're terrible, let's have a conversation. It was like, you're done. And that was alarming, for obvious reasons. Now, part of why that's alarming is that power already exists. The IRS can look at what you do and say, that is not okay, that violates federal law, state law, what have you, and they can challenge and pull your nonprofit registration. What we didn't actually realize, many of us, is that the president actually currently has that power thanks to the Patriot Act after 9/11. So the President of the United States, ever since September 11th, 2001, has been able, theoretically, to see a nonprofit operating in the United States say it's a terrorist organization and pull funding. It's happened a couple of times, actually. But this would have empowered the Secretary of the Treasury, which is a political appointee, which in the current context we were worried about because already nonprofits were being targeted by the incoming administration. And so we thought that's not something we want to see happen. So that was what we were targeting, is to try to oppose that section of that bill. It did pass the House, it did pass the Senate, it went away for now. But we think that strategy is still alive and well. So that's what we're concerned about. All right, so here's what has happened. Since January 20th, there have been, as of last Friday, 55 executive orders. This is not quite the record, but real darn close. And you can see there, and you know if you follow any kind of news, incredible range of executive orders on all kinds of issues, from sex and gender to climate to DEI to workforce to work at home versus go to the office to arts, culture, and humanities, to you name it. And a lot of this specifically targets the nonprofit sector. This is my shout out to NCN, among other things, as I mentioned earlier. So they're the ones that also have the tax policy package that I referenced to your question, but they also have been doing this since January 21st, and they're doing a brilliant job. Diane Yantel, who's the new CEO there, her first day on the job was the 10th of January. Welcome to your new job. But she's a veteran of the Low-Income Housing Coalition in Washington, D.C., and jumped right into this role. She's been great. And you'll probably see her out here. We're going to do a few trainings in California together. But they've been publishing this decoding of the executive orders and what they mean to the nonprofit sector. And so this has been updated. This is the one from February 10th, so just a few days ago. So that link will keep taking you to it. And as new executive orders come out, as they absolutely surely will, this will say, okay, this is what our attorneys think this means to the sector. This is what we're concerned about. This is where it's not really relevant. This is the part that's just virtue signaling. This is the part that's really policy, has policy implication. So that's a worthwhile tool. So this was really what I wanted to focus on. On the 27th of January, just a couple long weeks ago, this memo came out of OMB. It was about 5 o'clock on a Monday, and it got passed around quickly. I remember I was sitting in front of my laptop, and someone said, "Have you seen this?" And this was a 2-pager that was then accompanied by a 52-pager. And that pull-out quote on the right was the part that we all looked at. And basically, it was the first time that the executive branch has tried to specifically pause, meaning stop, maybe temporarily, question mark, all federal funding to organizations, all grants and contracts. We're talking about $3 trillion. And interestingly, it referred to 7 of those 55, 7 of the specific executive orders in that memo. And it used language that has probably never before appeared in an official federal document, like DEI, woke gender ideology, and Green New Deal. So that's a quote out of a memo, which is a little hard to get your mind around, but here we are. So what that probably targeted was vast, knowing the context and knowing what the executive orders would say. So there's a 52-page accompanying explainer that said, here's all the programs that we think this includes, and it was roughly 3,000. So, back to my friends at NCN, the next morning, they filed this lawsuit in district court in DC. So this was the first lawsuit, and it was our peers. This was a nonprofit sector in action. And they said, we're asking for an immediate injunction on this. We don't think this is legal or constitutional. It is freezing up what Congress has already approved. That is the purview of Congress, not the executive branch. And by the way, there's the 1974 Impoundment Act, and by the way, the last time the Supreme Court heard this, they lost 9-0, and by the way, we need some time to figure this out. On the heels of that, later that same day, 22 states, including our own, filed this lawsuit in Rhode Island. Same basic argument. In this case, they were focusing on the funding that goes from the federal government to the states, and that's also hundreds of billions of dollars. Both judges said, yeah, we think you're right. We need some time to look at this. We're going to put a stay on these things. The media started to catch up. Now remember the context of how many things are happening at once right here. And this is an intentional strategy that's been talked about by the administration, like flood the zone, all the things, like here, do everything at once. It's really hard to concentrate on any one of those things. And sure enough, believe people when they tell you what they're going to do is the moral of the story here. But there were 2,600. This is the number of programs targeted. And this was the first action again on that first lawsuit. This is Judge Lauren Alican. And she said, yep, we're going to have a brief administrative stay through February 3rd. That'll give us time to kind of figure out what's going on here. So the court took action. So did the White House. The White House said, no. We didn't mean all funding. We meant the funding that specifically is implicated in these 7 executive orders. And again, they're listed here. Those are the official titles of the executive orders. That was also referenced in that first memo. And the court said, no. And they said, okay, fine, never mind. So this 2-line memo came out on Wednesday. So this was not even 48 hours later, saying, we rescind the memo that came out on Monday night. Okay. And then within the hour, the new press secretary in the White House said, no, we didn't mean we pulled it back. There's no take backs. We still mean it, we just said the memo never happened. What? So the judge in the second case, and I will always love this judge for this, said, I can't cross-examine a tweet. So we're going to put a stay on this because you can't have it both ways. That was what he actually said. So either you're trying to end this funding or you're not, but you can't just pull back the memo and say, no, but we still mean it on the executive orders, but no, that's not. So they just said, stop, we have to have a bigger conversation here. So these were the 2 cases. And the second case on the heel, second judge on the heels of that said, yeah, this doesn't pass scrutiny. Now again, in the meantime, this was literally just a selection of headlines that I clipped off the web in that same 72-hour period. Like it's everywhere. It's all over. So it's a matter of, okay, what is really the goal here? This article, however, is something that got less attention, and I think it's worth noting that on the 7th, so last Friday, 6 days ago, the president issued a memo, not an executive order, from himself and the White House saying, again, basically reiterating what the original memo from the prior week had said. And saying, I am still asking every agency head now he has the power as the executive branch to say to agency heads, I want you all to look at what's being funded through the lens of my executive orders, and you're going to have to stop funding the things that would violate those. So we're still in the middle of this. And what I want to do before I end here is, I'm always an optimist. There's 2 bright spots here in the law. One is the Constitution itself. Article 1 says Congress has the power of the purse. We've all been hearing that in these analyses. The only time this was really tested was 50 years ago during the Nixon administration when President Nixon tried to impound funds that had been approved by Congress. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled 9-0 against the administration. Now, yes, it was a different time. Yes, it was a different Supreme Court. Yes, it was a different administration. And there's a precedent here. The second thing is, on the heels of that, Congress said, oh yeah, by the way, that is the first article of the US Constitution. And by the way, the Supreme Court just reinforced that. And just in case you're unclear, we're going to pass another law saying this is the rule. And that was the Impoundment Act of 1974. And that basically says, again, Congress, we have this power. Now, Congress has to take that power and use that power. And like you, I'm not confident that they are doing that. But this is what the law says. So there is some history and some past decisions that suggest that if this fight gets pushed on both sides and goes all the way to the Supreme Court would probably take it up because it is a core constitutional powers issue. And there's history that suggests that Congress gets to decide where the money goes, executive branch administers that distribution, but they don't get to change the decisions made by Congress. The tricky part is going to be many congressionally approved programs are fairly broad in their discretion, and then they get interpreted through the executive branch and the agencies. That is appropriate. So if Congress was non-specific over here, there's really nothing to say that the executive branch can't say, okay, within this range that you've approved, we're going to go here. And so that's what we're all looking at. I think this is a long haul, back and forth, democratic debate to be had here. And I think we all need to be at the table, in the ring, in the conversation. And it's probably the most clear-cut case of really an existential threat to a lot of what the sector does. So, it's tough times, but we can do it. We've been here before. It's not completely unheard of. It feels that way, but there are things that have happened in our past that suggest that yes, there are ways forward. Yeah.
What can we do as your nonprofit volunteers to advocate for your efforts?
You can tell your stories. Interesting things started to happen after this week. The switchboard in both Senate and Congress was just jammed. And elected officials in Washington are starting to notice this, like, ooh, this is a little more pushback than I'm used to. There is no other way right now. Courts, the courts aren't a democratic process, they're a court process, and this is one of our other concerns, is they go at court pace. Court pace is slow. Throwing everything at the wall is fast. And so right now, that the strategy on the executive side is move quickly, try this, 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 and this. The courts are looking at the individual decisions and saying, no, yes, no, yes, no. So we don't know. When I said we've been here before, we've been here at some of these things. I don't know that this dynamic has been here before, at least not in a very long time. So I think it's just important to keep saying, this is what this means on the ground. Back to that storytelling. If you stop funding this, this is what it looks like. It's your child who doesn't get fed at school in the morning. So those are the things where people are not, and especially if you look at the language being used, that link is not being made. So everything we can do to make that link is what we're doing. Yes?
I very much love the message you're giving here, and that is step into your full self as a nonprofit by taking these actions because they're available to you. What is your thinking on more sort of attack dog entities like 501c4s and PACs and the role that they don't have now because they don't exist, but they could have as another gear turning in this process?
I think that's important. I mean, if you look at movement work and social policy over the last century, I would argue there's no significant social movement that hasn't had the nonprofit sector right in the center of it. I came originally from some environmental work, and the analogy I always used was, without Earth First, Sierra Club is radical. But if you got these guys over here going direct action, and legislators looking at the landscape, they'd rather talk to the Sierra Club than these folks over here. So you do need the range, insider and outsider, more aggressive and more policy-minded, negotiators in the room as well as people marching outside. I mean, I would argue all of that is part of the solution. So, that's my take.
We're going to have to continue the
And it's noon, and thank you.
Very much appreciate you coming out and sharing all this really valuable information. Think about joining Cal Nonprofits. If you're not already a member, think about joining TVNPA. We really need to stick together. It's critical now more than ever. So thank you all for coming out.